I had it around here someplace. Welcome into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. I've lost it. Welcome into Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. Have you seen it?
I'm not sure what you've lost.
What are we
Your
looking
mind?
for? Your marbles?
PLPC Carla McCormick and ace producer. He is Rapid Ruben Wright. And no, I've lost
Good
it.
evening, everyone.
I've lost it. I've completely lost it.
We
My
don't-
my manual.
Uh-oh.
My manual. How do you raise kids?
Yeah, we wish there was one.
Well, and if you're in recovery, how do you raise kids?
Whew. The best you can.
Yeah.
And you make a lot of mistakes.
Well, you probably, but you know what? We're going to put roots and wings to this. We're going to talk about mindful parenting this evening. Good evening, folks. Welcome into Strategies for Living. And, yeah, I may have lost it, but Ruben and Carla are here to hold it together.
Yeah, you get what you pay for.
Yeah, you do. And our life strategist this evening is going to talk to us about mindful parenting in recovery. He is the author of Roots and Wings. He's Dan Major. So stand by. He's coming. Folks, thank you for tuning in. Strategies for Living is presented by CADA, the Council on Alcoholism and Drug Abuse of Northwest Louisiana. Been helping individuals and families for 60 years now. We're also brought to you by Jerry Anderson, State Farm Insurance, by Learning RX, by Highland Place, Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well, Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. Back in a moment to meet our life strategist, Dan Major, here on Strategies.
What condition my condition was in.
If we're talking addiction prevention, education, and treatment in Shreveport-Bossier for
sites with over 1,000 reviews.
And welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan, PLPC Carla McCormick. Let's welcome to the program now Mr. Dan Majors, who has a Master of Social Work, and he's a writer in long-term recovery, a parent of 2 adult daughters. He received that MSW from the Hunter College of the City University of New York School of Social Work, has nearly 20 years of postmaster's experience as a psychotherapist, clinical supervisor and clinical director in a wide range of behavioral health and addiction treatment settings. And he's the author of Some Assembly Required, a balanced approach to recovery from addiction and chronic pain. He also writes for psychologytoday.com. Mr. Major, welcome.
Thank you so much, David. And Carla, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you for being on the show.
So, you get our attention right away, Dan. Quality parenting, you say, doesn't happen easily. It doesn't happen by coincidence. It necessitates conscious awareness. It necessitates intentional effort, and you talk about it, what a job you're tackling all of that and more here: recovery, parenting, and mindfulness. Oh my!
Yes, indeed, David. I of course overheard you and Carla talking prior to the intro about how you lost your parenting manual, and Carla mentioned that parents do the best they can.
Yeah.
And I absolutely believe that one of my approaches to understanding how people operate and how best to help them, regardless of the challenges that they present and that they may come to professionals for assistance around, that everyone does the best they can based on their current capacity. And the capacity of people to be attuned, skillful, effectively healthy parents depends on so many variables, one of which, of course, is how they were parented when they were children themselves. And sometimes parents do an excellent job of growing beyond how they grew up and how they were parented if their own experiences were problematic and relatively unhealthy. And obviously, there's an extremely wide range. And other parents really struggle, and their only frame of reference for parenting is their own experience with their parents.
Right.
And one of the things I endeavored to do with Roots and Wings Mindful Parenting and Recovery is to make connections between the processes of recovery and parenting as opportunities for learning, growth, and potentially healing, and to apply mindfulness practices to both as a way of giving parents information as well as practical guidance in improving their capacity to be the best parents they're able to be, which benefits them and their children immeasurably. And that's true whether parents are in recovery from a particular form of addiction or not.
Right. You're making the point. I mean, parenting in and of itself is difficult, but people in recovery from addiction, it gets real complicated, doesn't it? It can get real chaotic.
It absolutely can, and part of that, of course, is their own experiences. Growing up in families where there were difficulties and impairments in negotiating communication and expectations, establishing and maintaining a semblance of healthy boundaries, balancing love and limits, imposing appropriate consequences. These are challenging for every family, but for parents who themselves grew up in families with dysfunction that ranges from violations of trust, emotional neglect, rejection, inconsistent and unhealthy boundaries, to the full spectrum of verbal, emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, creating consistent structure and the positive discipline that skillful parenting requires is that much more challenging. And of course, there are many people who end up struggling with addiction grow up in those kinds of families. But obviously, obviously there's no such thing as a perfect family. And one of the things I like to reflect to folks that I work with is that normal families are families we simply don't know that well.
Right.
And that all families, no matter how together or successful, say from a material or relationship standpoint they seem to be, they all have their challenges. They all have their struggles. And parenting is, like maintaining an intimate partnership is among the most challenging and complex of all human activities. It gives us access to the most rewarding experiences, a level of joy and beauty that is really singular and unique. But in order to have access to that, we also have to make ourselves vulnerable to the most bitterly frustrating, difficult, and often brutally painful experiences that life has to throw at all of us from time to time.
Hey, Dan, I have a question, just kind of nuts and bolts here.
Absolutely,
When you are
Carla.
dealing with a client that is in recovery, and they're back into their family, and you're kind of reinventing the family system, so to speak. Where do you get that person in recovery to start? Because there's all of the guilt of all the things I didn't do wrong. Now I'm balancing how do I rebuild my family and go to all these meetings and all these things that are expected. Where do you start with that client? I mean, what's the first thing that they need to do to get on this road to mindful parenting?
That's a wonderful question, Carla, and it relates to an area that I address in the first part of the book, insofar as people in 12-step recovery, and not everyone in recovery participates in 12-step programs, but they are the recovery pathway through which more people have gotten and stayed clean, so to say, found recovery as a process and maintained it as a process of learning, growth, and healing than any other resource on the planet. And one of the sayings, if you will, almost a cliche in 12-step programs is that in order to be successful, you have to make your recovery absolutely, positively the highest priority. And the extent to which you do not is the extent to which you put your recovery at risk and potentially end up relapsing, in which case whatever people have gained to that point, they risk losing all over again. But for people with families, with who have children as well as marriages, what I suggest is very careful, conscious attention to balance, and to putting together a budget of sorts, in the same way that when we try to look at our finances and balance revenue against expense and determine what's left over and what has to go where. It's kind of like identifying the pieces of a puzzle and fitting them together so that the picture is clear, the pieces fit together, and so forth. The degree of balance for people in recovery who have families, who have children, particularly when children are younger, all the way through adolescence, that same degree of balance to identify what the pieces are and to try to configure them to meet the different, sometimes competing, often conflicting needs as well as possible is really critical. And for folks in especially early recovery, it's increased by the challenges of post-acute withdrawal, which is the withdrawal after the withdrawal, if you will, where people may have gone through detox, the alcohol and other drugs are no longer in their system physiologically, but over the course of time that someone uses alcohol or other drugs or is involved in addictive behaviors that have an obsessive compulsive dynamic to them. We're talking about gambling, eating, sex, et cetera. Their brain chemistry and structure and some of their physiology has shifted significantly because they've gotten used to this different approach to life, this different way of being in the world and dealing with difficulty, dealing with discomfort, and so post-acute withdrawal can take anywhere from 2 months to close to a year for some people for their bodies and brains to effectively turn right side out and re-equilibrate. So it is a very complicated process, and similar to there being no manual for parenting, there are no magic bullets, there are no quick fixes, but there are a great many approaches, a great many techniques and practices which can be extremely helpful, which can make positive differences that move people toward, and their families, toward greater balance and toward being a much more whole and healthy parent to their children.
We're going to take a break here. When we come back, Dan, I want to. That leads me into you talk early on. We've all heard the Serenity Prayer, and Carl Jung says, you quote him, "We can't change anything until we accept it." I want to talk about that with what you're just mentioning here. When we come back, can we do that?
Wonderful.
Roots
Absolutely.
and Wings, Dan Major. We're talking mindful parenting in recovery today with life strategist Dan Major. We'll be back with more strategies for living. slogans and the scene. I had it right from the beginning. That's the problem, right there, in a nutshell. You know, you got it, Ruben. You just you nailed it. We don't have to do the rest of the show now.
I'm a magic man. I'm
Yes,
telling
you are. But Dan wants us to do the rest of the show, so we better do that. Welcome back into Strategies for Living, 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL, and PLPC Carla McCormick, marriage and family therapist David McMillan. We're with the author of a brand new book at your favorite bookseller right now, out from Central Recovery Press. He's Dan Major, and the name of the book is Roots and Wings, Mindful Parenting in Recovery. Sometimes, Dan, you just got to suit up and show up, right?
Absolutely, David. And that's one of the morals of the story. We have to be there for our kids, not just physically, but to have an approach of emotional availability where we can be fully present mentally and emotionally with an open heart and an open mind to whatever they present to us, no matter how frustrating it might be, no matter the extent to which we might disagree with it or want to say, no, that's wrong, you need to do it this way, or when their emotions are such that parents struggle with that, because after all, what parent wants to see their kids in pain? We have the natural.
Well, we don't. None of us
take
do.
It away.
None of us want to
Exactly.
see our kids in pain. However, God grant me the serenity to accept the things that I can't change, the courage to change what I can, the wisdom to know the difference. I mentioned Carl Jung saying we can't change anything until we accept it, and it turns out that acceptance is not just a core principle of recovery, but it's also one of the cornerstones of mindfulness practice too, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's one of the cornerstones of many spiritual traditions throughout world history. And one of the bottom lines, David, is that we don't have to agree with something or approve of it in order to be able to accept it. Excuse me. With acceptance, even when it's begrudging, and sometimes it is, we simply give ourselves the opportunity to meet reality where it is, instead of reacting to it in a state of dissatisfaction that often is related to our attachment to the idea that things should be different than they are. In the case of our children, that our children should be different than they are.
Yeah.
That in this particular situation, they should be responding different than they are. Now, some of the greatest emotional pain comes from mobilizing and maintaining resistance to reality simply as it is. And acceptance is simply about discontinuing the fight against things we don't have yet desire, and things that we have but don't want. And so it's really about moving as gracefully as we can, finding ways to peacefully coexist with things as they are. And when we can do that with our kids, there is a profound therapeutic quality to it. And you know, as a marriage and family therapist, that by therapeutic I mean in general, not anything related to formal therapy.
Now, I'm thinking that this has something to do with the title of the book, Dan, Roots and Wings. Where did you get that title? Where does that title come from?
You know, that the title actually, David, comes from the title of one of the chapters in my first book, Some Assembly Required: A Balanced Approach to Recovery from Addiction and Chronic Pain. And so when it came time to think in terms of a second book. One of the areas of research I did suggested that for parents in recovery, there were virtually no books available. A search of Amazon revealed maybe 8 or 10, and everything that was available was more than 10 years old, and the vast majority were oriented towards mothers specifically, rather than parents in general. And there's very little in the literature also that seeks to apply mindfulness practices to parenting. And it's one of the things that does is dramatically expand our emotional availability and our potential to be intentional and skillful. So my frame of reference related to the title of Roots and Wings is that when we do our jobs as parents well, we give our kids roots, and then we help them grow wings. And roots are a stable, solid attachment that connects parents and their children, and connects our kids to the world and to other people in a healthy way as we model that way of being in the world and with others. It's a secure foundation from which children can grow and develop, and it's connected to attachment theory from a psychological development standpoint. Wings, on the other hand, equip our kids to separate and individuate from us in age and developmentally appropriate ways as they move from being young children into latency age, into preteens, adolescents, and young adults with greater independence and autonomy, supporting that in whatever healthy ways we can, and helping them to take off from the secure base of the roots, that we help them to grow toward a future of their own choosing.
Yeah, because we've all got to grow up beyond how we grew up. I love the quote from Robert Hunter, Robert Hunter's Broken Down Palace, Grateful Dead. It's a far gone lullaby sung many years ago. Mama, mama, many worlds I've come since I first left home.
Robert Hunter is perhaps my very favorite lyricist, David, and I was deeply honored to be able to get permission to use that lyric in that way for the book.
So, you also talk about how trauma is much more common than we would think. How common is it? Is what the question begs, Dan. How common is trauma?
Well, I would dare say, David, that just about everyone has experienced some degree of trauma, and in the book, as you know, I distinguish between big T traumas and small T traumas,
right.
And I certainly didn't develop that framework. That's been around for probably the better part of 10 years at this point.
Yes.
Now, trauma, as most people understand it, comes in the big T forms, and we're talking about acts of terrorism, natural disasters, floods,
having an experience at war, watching some of your buddies get wounded. That's big T trauma.
Exactly, and being the victim of violent crime, or even victimized by violence within one's family, physically and sexually, qualifies as a more substantial trauma, which dramatically affects people's sense of themselves and their ability to manage and tolerate their emotions and how they relate to other people. On the other hand, small T traumas are those failures of attunement, so to say, where children, especially when they're very young, their parents respond to them in a way that's angry or distracted
The child feels abandoned or rejected in some way.
Right, and those are they're mini abandonments or rejections, if you will. They happen in the context of normative interactions where even like a child wants a parent's attention, and the parent is watching TV or they're on their smartphone or they're reading the paper or otherwise involved elsewhere. And obviously, I'm not suggesting in any way that parents should drop whatever it is that they're doing, no matter how important it is, in order to attend to their kids' need for attention. However, an awful lot of the time, we allow ourselves as parents to be distracted in a way that's unconscious and mindless, and get caught up in Facebook or the news or whatever it might be, when the reality is that in those moments, turning off the TV, putting down the smartphone or whatever it is, and orienting ourselves to being physically and emotionally available, fully present with our kids, sends an incredibly powerful message that they are important and they are worthy of our attention. And that facilitates, when that happens in a pretty consistent way, not in a perfect way, but in a pretty consistent way, what kids learn is self-acceptance, which is one of the keys to mental and emotional health. So what we're talking about are mini or micro failures of attachment, failures of connection. So it's fascinating, and in the book I cited this. There was an extensive meta-analysis of hundreds of scientific studies that included nearly 2,000 young children in 8 different countries, and the results of that research indicated that upwards of 40 to 50% of young children had insecure attachments, had symptoms of small t traumas because their primary caregivers were distracted, dismissive, unreliable, absent, self-absorbed, overbearing, or at times simply threatening. And it's really through a variety of mindfulness practices that parents can dramatically shift their relationship to their own experience and realize, okay, whatever I'm doing right now isn't really that important. What's more important is being there physically as well as emotionally for my child, and working on expanding our emotional capacity, developing the ability to observe and to be non-judgmentally present.
Well, when we come back,
emotions.
from this break, I want to talk about how we do that. How do we make the shift from mindful versus mindful? When we come back with Dan Major. The book is Roots and Wings, Mindful Parenting in Recovery. We'll be back. More strategies to come.
I knew his love could fill an ocean.
When your child or
welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. Marriage and family therapist David McMillan, PLPC Carla McCormick, with the author of Roots and Wings. He is Dan Major. It's Mindful Parenting in Recovery.
But before you guys went to, before we went to break, I was thinking, in my own recovery with young teenagers and a young daughter, the hardest part for me was getting my head around how do I reconnect with my kids, because all the boxes were checked. They got to school on time, they had their lunches, they had their dinner, they were
the little league coach.
Yeah, I was what some people in recovery call functioning alcoholic. But when you really look at it and you look back, there is no such thing as functioning alcoholic, because maybe the boxes were checked, but I wasn't there emotionally present. You can read a book to a kid and not be emotionally present. You can listen to your kids talk and not be emotionally present. So, for me it was, you can call it mindfulness, but for me it was reconnecting. How do I reconnect with these kids that I love dearly, and in a way make amends? AA talks a lot about making amends, but there's something that we call emotional amends or living amends, and that's just being there, walking the talk, doing it, and letting them see that it's not just today, it's not this week, but being there every day, making that connection. And I wish that I'd had a book like this, because you don't know, you make a lot of mistakes, especially with teenagers.
There's a lot here, Dan. This book is rich.
Thank you so much, David. And Carla, I absolutely empathize with your experience, because nearly 12 years ago, when I entered recovery, my daughters were 19 and 14, respectively. And similarly, by most all outward appearances, I was completely functional all the way up until the very end of my active addiction. But you're also correct in that reconnecting it takes place one interaction at a time. We talk about recovery as taking place one day at a time, but it really takes place, recovery and life, one moment at a time. And each time we're connected emotionally as well as physically with our kids, when we are present-centered in the moment with them, we are attuned and skillful in ways that help to repair the trust that gets frayed during and often in the immediate aftermath of active addiction.
Even dealing with their anger. I mean, because when you're talking about teenage kids that are old enough to know what's going on, they're angry. So at some point you have to say, I understand this doesn't make sense to you. I understand that you don't understand how I could have done those things. And for me, I have to say, I don't understand some of the things I did. Doesn't make sense to me, but I'm sorry and forgive me, and that's not who I am anymore. That's tough.
And is that
Go ahead, David.
Is that part of what we were, I mentioned before the break? Is what you guys are talking about here? Is this mind full? My mind is absolutely full, because you point out, Dan, the mind is a storyteller. So our mind is full. Do we need to make that shift to being mindful, to being present and here, not just one time, not just a dozen times, but over and over and over and over?
I'm also in recovery, Dan, by the way. So I this book resonates really well with me, and it's also very well written. But what I would say, David, is we have to be careful to, and I think that Dan addressed this in the beginning, and you can help me out here, Dan, is that it's really easy as addicts to switch from the lifestyle of being an addict, because there's a lot that goes on with it, just even with the drinking. When am I going to drink? How am I going to drink? When am I going to sober? How am I going to get it?
Right.
To switching from, now I've got to go to a meeting every day and I've got to call my sponsor and I've got to do this and do this. So we switch our busyness and our activity from one kind of addiction to another. Is that something you can relate to, Dan?
Absolutely, Carla. And that was one of my struggles my first year in particular, was how, as I mentioned before, how to best balance learning how to live without being involved with using alcohol and other drugs with the rest of my responsibilities. And it's a profoundly difficult adjustment. And as you and as David suggests, this is something that has to happen. I mean, when being there for our kids is, because they're only going to trust us fully when they have a clear and complete sense that things are different and that we really are qualitatively different in general as well as with them. And that takes repeated experience over time. One of the things that, go ahead.
I was going to say it was months and months before I stopped watching my kids walk by and look at what was inside of my cup on the kitchen counter, because they just kind of, and you can just kind of catch them. And, I couldn't get mad. I couldn't get upset. I mean, I had done that. And, so, it was a big day when they stopped checking to see what was in Mom's cup. Yeah.
Well, and you mentioned in the book, Dan, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Yeah.
Exactly. One of my very favorite sayings, David, in that pain, both physical and emotional, and often they run together,
right,
is simply part of being human. Suffering, on the other hand, how we respond to the pain we experience, the extent to which we fight against it versus accept it for what it is, learn how to live with it as gracefully as we can, let it run its course, because the vast majority of pain, especially emotional pain, it's only going to last so long. And if we don't act on it on our own discomfort in ways that make it worse, in which case we'll not just make it worse, but usually make it last longer, it will run its course, and things will sort themselves out and become smoother. And that's true with our, as Carla was mentioning, with our kids' anger. Being able to tolerate our kids' emotions, that's an essential mindfulness practice, to be aware of our own emotions consciously, because most people aren't. They may know that they're feeling anxious or fearful or angry or frustrated or sad or depressed, guilty, ashamed, whatever, on some level, but they're not conscious enough about it to say, okay, this is how I'm feeling. What do I want to do with it? How can I respond intentionally to this feeling in a way that makes the circumstance either neutral or more positive, as opposed to acting out on our difficult, uncomfortable emotions in ways that make the situation worse, which many parents do in response to their children's anger.
That's our nature as addicts, though, don't you think, Dan? I mean, we complicate and we make everything harder than it has to be. I can vividly remember, weeping and saying, I don't know, you guys, I pray the serenity prayer, and it says, accept the things I cannot change, encourage to change the things I can, and weeping because I couldn't figure out what went in what column. So worried that I was trying to accept things I was trying to change, and change things I was trying to accept. And finally, my wise mother said, babe, that's why you pray for wisdom. And I was like, okay.
We're with Dan Major today. He is the author of Roots and Wings, Mindful Parenting in Recovery at your favorite bookseller, out from CRP, Central Recovery Press. We'll be back to wrap up with Dan here on Strategies.
This is the craziest party that could ever be. Don't turn on the lights, cause I don't want to see. Mama told me not to come.
You know they're all. Resist.
The first thing I remember knowing was a lonesome whistle blowing.
Welcome back. Welcome back into 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. Welcome back into Strategies for Living. Marriage and family therapist David McMillan, PLPC Carla McCormick, and, of course, Rapid Ruben Wright with all the great music in between. We are with Dan Major today. He is the author of Roots and Wings, Mindful Parenting in Recovery, at your favorite bookseller, out from Central Recovery Press. Just got a couple of minutes here to kind of ice this cake, Dan.
David, if it's okay, I'd just like to address very briefly your question before about how do we move from having our mind full to being mindful.
Very
and
good.
That's such a critical aspect of what the book is about, and about how we move towards being more attuned and skillful with our kids. And it basically has to do with coming to conscious awareness of what our experience is internally, and even asking ourselves internally, to what extent am I paying attention with intention to where I am, who I'm with, and what I'm doing right now, versus getting caught up in thinking about what happened in the past or what might happen in the future, whether it's about work or what have you, and use that conscious awareness to say, okay, I need to be here and now.
This is
and
a how-to.
we-
This book is a how-to get free and become the master of your thinking instead of slave to your thoughts. That's kind of the way I see it.
Exactly. Mindfulness is really a form of training our mind so that it is more likely to focus on what we intend.
Dan, thank you so much. I wish we had more time. We don't. So I'm going to invite people to continue the conversation with you through Roots and Wings, your new book, Dan Major, Mindful Parenting and Recovery.
Thank you, Dan.
And thank you, Carla.
Thank you, David and Carla.
You
I
bet.
really appreciate the time with you.
And folks, thank you for tuning in. We've been brought to you by CADA, by Jerry Anderson, by Learning RX, by Highland Place Rehab and Nursing Center, by Jacob's Well Inspirational Books and Gifts, and by Resilient House. If today were the last day of your life, you only had one more phone call to make, who would you call? What would you say? And why are you waiting? Make the call. For Dan Major and for our PLPC Carla McCormick, for Reuben Wright, I'm marriage and family therapist David McMillan. See you next time on Strategies for Living.
Breaking news and trending talk. This is 101.7 FM and 710 KEEL. KEEL, Shreveport.